Welcome everyone to this second day of our international symposium of the International Society of the Philosophy of Chemistry. Today we'll start our meeting with Marabel Riesmeier, chemical substances, more or less natural kinds. Welcome.
Hello, thank you all for coming. I am going to talk to you about chemical substances and what they can tell us about natural kinds, and how certain chemical substances can be used to complicate the picture that we tend to have of natural kinds. And then building on that, I'm hopefully going to show you how I think an account of natural kinds could look like that is able to account for these things that chemical substances tell us about natural kinds. Right, so the most common definition that is cited and that you see of natural kinds is that of Bird and Tobin in the Stanford Encyclopedia entry, which is to say that a kind is natural, is to say that it corresponds, is to say that it corresponds to a grouping that reflects the structure of the natural world rather than the interests and action of human beings. And this is one very common definition, but if you read other papers, very, very similar sentiments across most people who talk natural kinds, something like this will occur. So let's have a little bit of a closer look here. So what we have here is basically we have nature, we have the object, then we have humans, the subject, and we have natural kinds that are, so the world has some kind of existing structure that we have, so the natural structure of the world, and we are able to grasp this underlying existing structure of the world, at least some of the time, well enough to come to natural kind terms that reflect this underlying structure. So this is sort of what this presupposes, this view of natural kinds. So as soon as we so this is very unidirectional, right? We are starting from nature, and whatever we're getting here, this is where what we call natural kinds. So as soon as humans are either adding their own things to these natural kinds terms and adding categorizations that we can't really that aren't passively taken from nature, we're getting to different categorizations, and we don't know anymore whether they map onto the structure of the natural world. They well might be, but we have no real way of assessing that, and so we're better off, and this is the sort of idea that this view takes for granted, is we're better off just not saying these are natural in any way, right? Because we don't know that. So this is sort of as soon as human interests come in, we are sort of picking and choosing what properties we want to have as determining a natural kinds, then we can't really be sure anymore whether that reflects the natural world or not. Or we can just straight up say, no, it doesn't. And then besides the interest in the mind independence, so the independence of human interest, the independence of the picking and choosing, we also have this independence of human actions in this definition. So in this interdependence of human actions, which I will call intervention independence here, we are basically saying that as soon as humans are meddling with the world, as soon as there's any potential of the humans changing any kind of structure in the world, then even if we're still sort of passively observing the kinds that come from that, that is not a natural kind. As soon as that, we're basically, the humans are tainting the naturalness of those kindhood, of this kindhood, and we very well have kinds, and we have kinds that are mind independent. Well, we meddled with the world and now they are there, but we don't really have, we can't really call them natural anymore, basically, because again, first of all, we can in many cases just assume they wouldn't have been there without our interference, and even if they would have been after we meddled with the world, we basically can say, all right, we can't really be sure anymore whether we brought these kinds into existence, so better not say they're natural then. So this kind of idea of human independence is fairly restrictive in scope, and kind of depends on this very dichotomous view of humans and nature. So we've got naturalness, which is basically construed as an absence of humans. As soon as humans humans meddle with the concepts, as soon as humans meddle with the world, that naturalness goes away. So we are tainting naturalness by our presence, and so in that then follows that naturalness is either distorted or undetermined. And so this is true both for the intervention dependence and for the mind dependence. Right, okay. So now I'm going to go into two cases of chemical substances that may plausibly considered natural kinds. So I want you to kind of put aside your kind of opinion on natural kinds for now, whether you think chemical substance can actually be natural kinds or not. I just want to convince you that, well, if we have these two substances, they seem to us, I think, intuitively, especially the chemists among us, to have an equal claim to natural kindhood, right? If we believe one is a natural kind, then we plausibly also should believe that the other is a natural kind. And this is basically based on the whole system of chemical classification, right? So the properties that make these kinds, like chemical bonds, like the atoms that are in them and how they are connected, these are things that hold across them, even though the properties apply in different ways. And we can basically compare them on all these accounts that we think are relevant, and would come to the conclusion that, yes, well, here atoms may be connected in this way, here atoms may be connected in this way, but they're both equally natural, right? Okay, I hope this seemed quite convincing. I think that side probably doesn't need much convincing to an audience that's familiar with chemistry. Right, now compare cubane to a microscope. And a microscope is something that in most accounts of natural kinds would not necessarily be considered a natural kind, because it is something that is very, very dependent on our intervention. There are some accounts that basically only consider mind independence, but if intervention dependence figures at all in our accounts, microscopes are something that there's a lot of work that goes into building them. Basically, that a microscope just doesn't exist out there in the world, but we're actively building it, putting it together. It really depends on us planning it. It depends on us designing it. It depends on our intentions of what we want to do with this, and then we're bringing it about. So microscope, heavily intervention dependent in this sort of genealogical sense of or historical sense of how we made any particular microscope. Then cubane, if we are taking this similar view that we just applied to microscopes, well, it was complicated to build, we had to design it. This also applies to cubane, actually. So the synthesis of cubane is a fairly complex procedure, and something that was for quite a while actually considered impossible. So for some time, people thought, well, thermodynamically this just cannot exist. It's just a curiosity of the mind. Then at some point, people started to think, well, there's a chance that it could exist, but still how to make it is it's very, very complex, and because it's so thermodynamically unfavored, there's a good chance we'll never make it. Turns out it's actually quite kinetically stable, and we can actually make cubane, and we well, not routinely, but we do a lot of the time now. Right, so still, because it's like a multi-step synthesis that's fairly complex, depends on a lot of factors being present and a lot of steps being followed in the right order, and a lot of designing goes into it, a lot of well, getting around this thermodynamic instability. We have something that on this account resembles the microscope in terms of its naturalness. We made it in a similar way. And the same is not true when we look at ethanol. Although we can synthesize ethanol, we are also finding it in the world. It exists out there, right? We can use analytical chemistry to find ethanol. We can use those same analytical procedures to analyze and look at cubane, but we first have to make it. That doesn't mean it's completely impossible for cubane to exist anywhere in the universe without human intervention. However, it is also not completely impossible for microscopes to exist somewhere in the universe without human intervention, right? It seems a lot more unlikely in the case of microscopes, but that's only because it's a lot bigger, right? Okay, so is cubane a natural kind then? Well, so we have a lot of sophisticated measurements that tell us it's probably actually there in the world in some sense. It's considered like the measurements that we make are consistent with predictions, and it's at least unlikely to be a pure projection onto the world. If we are realist, if we are completely anti-realist about it, well, natural kind of fails to adhere to anything really. Although there are some accounts, I'm not saying it's completely impossible. Right. However, there are idealizations that we make. So something like chemical bonds, something like atoms, something like this separation into these units of matter that we are doing when we're doing chemical classification. We know a lot of that is an idealization, and as an idealization as such, it's necessarily mind dependent, right? Like the chemical bond, like the isolation. Still, if we're pressed, we probably would go with the mind independent side, even though there's some idealization there going on. Then intervention independence. So it could plausibly exist without humans. If we are just purely looking at sort of the potential energy surface of every substance that could possibly exist in the universe, it's definitely on there. And that sort of chemical space is not in itself human dependent. So in that sense, synthesis is also sometimes understood as a discovery rather than a generation of something. However, I hopefully have established that it is at least very unlikely to exist without human intervention, and the potential to exist in the world in any other scenario with things like microscopes and houses and tables or statues of ducks, I don't know. With all these things, we wouldn't really accept potential to exist in the world, just the baseline rough idea that it can possibly exist in the universe as a condition of naturalness, right? That would be way, way too permissive. That would mean pretty much everything that we see in the world is natural, including complex human societies, including abstract concepts like peace or something. We can all somehow break that down to this potential existence. So in this way, we would probably lean towards the well, it is more on the side of intervention dependent. So why not abandon natural kinds at all then? Well, we could, yes, but I think it's kind of uninteresting to do so. I think already this has shown that there are nuances to be explored here, and by just abandoning the naturalness as a concept, I think we're letting go of a very rich idea to be explored. Why not be very permissive? Well, again, we could be, but I think if we are trying to get at I think we want to try to get at something that we actually mean by naturalness. Furthermore, there are ethical implications when we are taking this naturalness to more human contexts. So if we're saying just like something like race or neurodivergence and things like these are just straightforwardly natural without any kind of additional nuance, that is something that has historically not gone necessarily great. Right, so we could say, right, we've got like cubane might fall, if we're talking about intervention, might fall here, and ethanol might fall here. If we're talking about mind independence, they're equally natural. However, we still think that cubane is more, so to say, intervention independent than something like the English language, right? So the English language is so purely humanly constructed that we think something like cubane, where actually there is like a fairly independent potential for it to exist that we're getting at, that intuitively we would not say, oh yeah, like it's just as unnatural, so to say, as the English language. The problem is we cannot have such a spectrum with the human independence view, because the independence is defined only by reference to dependence. And dimensions are possible, but there's no spectrum that's possible. So I think I don't really have that much time left, so I'm not going to get into other accounts as much. But there are some accounts that basically based on interconnection or based on clustering properties plausibly seem to at least allow for a spectrum. So if we're looking at Boyd's property cluster view, we could say, yeah, they share more properties, they share fewer properties. But again, it doesn't really tell us about the strength of how we want to value these properties. And Boyd basically just says, yeah, the interests of the scientists, and if we just apply these differently to different situations, it doesn't allow any comparison, right? And then we've got Khalidi's causal view, again, that plausibly allows us for this varied assessment where natural kinds are nodes in causal networks, and they can be more or less interconnected. But what about the strength of connection? How do we weigh that? We don't really get a straightforward spectrum out of that either. We seem to, but not really. So what I'm proposing is that I do think counterfactual stability, that I do think that this naturalness actually plausibly does track something like human independence. I do think if we, most of the accounts of natural kindhood, but also most of the things that we tend to call natural in our everyday lives, do track whether we can find it, whether we didn't make it, whether it's independent of us in some sense. So I want to propose that we can think of natural kinds as kinds that are counterfactually stable to human intervention and human minds as causally relevant kinds. So going back to the Khalidi view, basically, thinking of kinds as embedded in a causal network. So first, I'm saying that they are consistently implicated in a network of causes and effects. This is something that Khalidi also says, but he basically says that, well, any kind that is consistently embedded in a network of causes and effects is a natural kind. are there truly arbitrary kinds that are not embedded in any causal network at all? Even the most basic examples I could give you of arbitrary kinds probably depend on some causal network of psychological factors, right? So I don't think that that's really great, because it's, again, way too permissive. However, we can think of human dependence as something that we can think about in counterfactual scenarios. So we can start thinking, okay, so if humans weren't there, if humans didn't do this specific intervention, if humans wouldn't do this specific form of conceptualizing, then at some point in that process, at some point across these like counterfactual scenarios that further and further remove humans from the picture, we get to more or less natural kinds. Thank you.
Okay, now we have 10 minutes for questions. Peter, please. And then, yes, Michelle, and then Farzad.
Yeah, thank you, Marabel. Really interesting. The question I wanted to ask is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with some of the papers that Robin Hendry wrote on natural kinds, because I think he raised an interesting comment when he said that it's important not to confuse two kinds of naturalness, namely whether a substance, a chemical substance, is naturally occurring or not, has actually very little to do with the naturalness of the category under which it falls. And so he gave, for example, the example of fluorine, which is not naturally occurring because it's too reactive. Yet Lavoisier already included it in his list of simple substances. Mendeleev included it in his periodic table long before Moissan, I think in 1886, isolated it. So I wonder what your thoughts are on this, and cubane seems to be a very similar example to fluorine in that sense.
Yeah, so I think it's sort of chemical or chemist's idea of naturalness. I agree that it very much diverges from sort of the popular idea of naturalness, which often poses chemical in opposition to natural, right? And like occurrence in the world in opposition to natural. And I think as chemists, we are very quick to dismiss that, because we know in every relevant sense that is in how bad it is for humans, how useful something is, how effective at whatever thing we might want to make it is something is, this sort of occurrence in the world is completely irrelevant, right? So we're dismissing this version of naturalness completely. However, if we're looking at most of the natural kinds discourse, human intervention and this kind of do we find it in the world or not, I don't think can be completely dismissed, right? So if we are building a complex machine versus if we are if we just find a leaf outside, sure, we could say both of these are natural, but I don't think this really gets at what we want to do with the word natural, what the word natural does in most contexts. So I think we shouldn't basically go all the way, take chemistry and say, yeah, this version of natural as found in the world versus not found in the world is to be completely dismissed outright. We should say this kind of naturalness is not relevant for most purposes, and we should really shy away from saying this is good because it's natural or something. It is natural as in found in the world sense, but we shouldn't assign that kind of importance, but we shouldn't dismiss it in our
I think that was Henry's point as well. So even though a microscope is artificially made and you won't naturally find it in the world, the question for the natural kind debate is not whether a microscope is natural, it's whether the microscope as a category is a natural division of the world. And I think the same applies to all of these chemical substances. Are the categories into which we classify all these chemical substances, are those natural, and why would cubane be a natural category and a microscope not? I think that's
so if we are so we could think about a microscope in terms of sort of purpose, right? And in that sense, it would very much not be a classification in the natural world. But if we're looking at, for example, like how light hits a microscope, and that happens in fairly specific ways, we could very easily come up with a conception of a microscope based on this physical hitting of the light. And at that point, how is this more or less sort of rooted in the physical world than something like cubane?
First Michelle, and then Farzad, and then that's it. Okay. It's already time of Peter. So let us short if you can, please.
Okay.
Or the shortest you can.
Yeah. I'll ask a very, very quick question. So what is this might help to clear up what's going on. And I applaud your attempts to sort of be a little bit more sophisticated about what's going on with natural kinds. But what questions would it answer if one were to be able to say definitively, this is a natural kind and this is not? Because you've asked questions about, you talk about morality, for example. Is that the pressing issue, or is it some other issue?
So this is a very good question, and something I think is not often answered in the natural kinds debate. So one thing that people tend to say is sort of stability under intervention. So natural kinds are something that we can that we can rely on to make inferences, stable inferences about the world. And I think this kind of view of naturalness that doesn't pose naturalness as something that's either completely there or completely not there lets us explore basically in how far do we have that stability under intervention, in how far does it allow us to make stable inferences, and sort of explore more closely the scenarios in which such inferences would be allowable versus not allowable. And I think that's an advantage of this spectrum view, as opposed to pure natural kindhood versus just not natural kind. And this tends to be what people want to get out of natural kinds.
Okay, thank you. What about you, Farzad? We can hear you now.
Thank you. Try to be quick. Yeah, the whole discussion, once you started, you're kind of boxed in. The whole discussion of natural kinds, once you started, you're boxed into choices that are not necessarily great. And I think your discussion really brings that out, as well as the questions that were brought up, which were excellent as well. If the major need is to make stable inferences, once again, it has to be brought in inferences about what, for what, and you head back to human purpose. So if you start with mind independence, you're kind of screwed from the beginning in terms of getting to something definitive and correct once and for all, which is the obsession of traditional contemporary philosophy. Okay, having made my little speech there, I would offer, in terms of something inside your discussion, a straightforward way to set out a spectrum would be money. Ethanol, I don't think it appears pure in the natural world anywhere. It still costs something to get pure ethanol if you're into purity of that type, which chemistry is, and perhaps natural kind discussions, some of them are. But cubane costs a lot. Fluorine costs a lot. And so you could make a spectrum pretty straightforwardly in terms of what it costs today, what it cost 50 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever. And that would kind of tie up that little problem. And I'm wondering what you think of that, what issues there are, if that actually answers the spectrum question or not. Because it pulls in, the money necessarily pulls in a lot of causal relations, all the instrumentation, even the microscope, it's built on causal natural kinds, if you want to say that the way you did with the light, but it still costs money to produce. And there you get all the human stuff coming in. But in any case, forgetting all that, what do you think about money?
So I think, I mean, like you can create lots and lots of spectra pertaining to kinds, and surely costs of making something is one of them, and that doesn't really work for all kinds. I don't think it very much works for naturalness as a whole. If we're only looking at chemical substances, then I can see how it's approximating something that's similar to what I'm trying to get at. However, if we want to, and I'm very much trying to use chemical substance here as a sort of case to critique and work on the more broader picture of natural kinds, and their money very quickly just completely, it becomes completely nonsensical, right? So if we're talking about whether a black hole is a natural kind, how much money does it cost to make a black hole? That's not really a sensible question to ask, right?
Well, actually, no, I think it is a sensible question to ask. How much money does it take to do high energy physics and cosmology compared to other fields which reveal different natural kinds in the world, like black holes? You can bring it back into the discussion. You always have to, I guess, consider the fact of who is talking, why they are talking, what are they talking about, and then you're back to some of the things that Clevis was talking about yesterday, but basically how the world is set up to talk about such things, and Michelle's question of what is answered by asking the question.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't think that really defeats my point that money is at best an approximation of something, and there are limiting cases in which it completely falls flat. And also the sort of economic fact, there are many economic factors like demand and things like this that kind of distort this approximation, even though it may work in some cases.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you for that. Now